The first stone hit the old woman in the shoulder and the second one hit her across the face, and by the time the crowd pulled back their arms for a third, Nara had already walked into the middle of it. The old woman was on the ground with her hands over her head and blood running down her temple, and the people of the village were standing around her in a circle with more stones in their hands and satisfaction on their faces. Nara had seen a lot of things in her 22 years. She had never been able to walk past one of them. She planted herself over the old woman's body and the next stone caught her across the cheek instead. She turned and looked at the crowd and said, "She is an old woman. Put the stones down." The crowd did not put the stones down. What came next was not stones. Hands grabbed her from 3 directions at once, pulling her hair and shoving her sideways, and she went down on one knee and pushed back up and went down again harder and pushed back up again, because she had never once in her life stayed down when she could get up. The old woman beneath her was grabbing her sleeve and begging her to run, and Nara was not running. She was down for the 3rd time with boots swinging toward her when every person in that square stopped moving. She looked up from the ground and saw him at the edge of the square on horseback with his men behind him. The crowd had gone completely silent and stepped back on both sides without being told to, clearing the space between themselves and him like a decision they all made at exactly the same moment. He rode forward and stopped where she was kneeling on the ground with blood on her face and her hand pressed flat over the old woman beneath her. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. He got down from his horse and crouched in front of her so that his face was level with hers and looked at her directly with dark, steady eyes. Then he reached out and wiped the blood from her cheek with his thumb, slow and unhurried, and she was so surprised by the gentleness of it that she forgot for a moment to breathe. "Can you stand?" he asked. "I was standing fine before they knocked me down," she said. He stood and offered his hand and she took it and got to her feet and released his hand the moment she was upright. He turned to the crowd and said quietly, "If I come through this square tomorrow and this woman has been touched, don't make me look for you." Then he walked back to his horse and swung up and looked at Nara one more time before he rode away with his men and disappeared down the road. The square stayed silent. Nara looked down at the old woman still on the ground beside her. "Who was that?" she asked. The old woman looked up at her with sharp eyes and said, "Alpha Cress." Nara helped her to her feet and looked at the empty road and said nothing. Behind her the crowd was already dispersing, melting back into the market like nothing had happened, like they had not just been throwing stones at an old woman 5 minutes ago. The old woman squeezed her hand once and looked at her with an expression Nara could not read. "Thank you, child," she said softly. "You have no idea what you just did." Nara opened her mouth to answer. But the old woman had already turned and was walking away slowly into the crowd and was gone before Nara could ask her what she meant. Chapter 1. Nara came through the door and her mother saw her face immediately and said, "What did you do?" before she had taken 2 steps inside. "Nothing," Nara said, moving to the water basin in the corner. Her father didn't look up from his chair. He never looked up when it was Nara coming through the door. She cleaned the dried blood from her cheek and said nothing more and caught Eid's eye across the room where he was sitting on his mat trying very hard not to react to the state of her face. She winked at him. He pressed his lips together and winked back and looked at the floor and she felt the tight thing in her chest loosen just slightly the way it always did when she could make him smile. They ate. Her father first, her mother second, Eid third, and Nara ate what was left the way she always did, standing by the basin, and nobody said anything worth remembering and the evening settled into the particular quiet of a house where very little warmth lived. She was almost asleep on her mat when the wolf came through the wall. The sound of it was enormous, splintering wood and cold night rushing in all at once and something massive landing in the center of the room with yellow eyes catching the moonlight and fixing immediately on Eid sleeping on the floor. Her father scrambled back against the far wall. Her mother screamed. The wolf moved toward Eid with the focused certainty of a creature that had already made its decision and Nara was between them before she had finished waking up, grabbing the farming blade off the wall beside the door and driving it into the wolf's shoulder before it reached her brother. The wolf turned on her. Her father was pressed against the wall. Her mother was in the corner. Neither of them moved. The wolf's jaw closed around her left forearm with a force that turned the entire world white and silent and she drove the blade into its neck with her right hand, once and twice and 3 times, until its jaw opened and it staggered backward through the broken wall and was swallowed by the dark outside. The room went completely still. Eid was on his feet screaming her name. Nara stood in the wreckage of the broken wall with her left arm pressed against her chest and looked at her brother's face, unharmed, completely unharmed, not a mark on him, and felt the pain arrive in full now that the decision was over and there was nothing left to do but feel it. She sat down on the floor. Her father peeled himself off the wall and crossed the room and looked at her arm, and his face did something she had never seen it do before, not with grief, not with gratitude, but with a fury that had nowhere reasonable to land and landed on her anyway. "You foolish girl," he said. "You stupid foolish girl. What man is going to marry you now? You are already an Omega and now you have done this. What have you done?" Nara looked up at him from the floor. "Eid is alive," she said. "And you are ruined," her father said. "Do you understand what you have done to this family?" Eid made a sound from across the room. Small and broken and 12 years old. Her mother stood in the corner with her arms folded and her eyes somewhere above Nara's head and said nothing. The physician came in the morning and did what physicians did when the news was not good. He worked quietly and efficiently and packed his things and left without meeting anyone's eyes. Nara sat through all of it without making a sound. Her father stood in the doorway watching and said nothing while the physician was there, and the moment the cart disappeared down the road he put on his coat and said he was going out and left. He came back in the afternoon with Torin. The whole village knew Torin. Everyone on the South Road knew him, and everyone at the market knew him, and every woman who had ever made the mistake of being alone near him knew him in a way they did not discuss in polite company. He was wide and thick-necked with small flat eyes and hands that were permanently stained from the butcher's block, and he already had 3 wives living in his house on the South Road, which the village also knew and which nobody with any power had ever seen fit to address. He stood in the center of their small house and looked at Nara the way he looked at everything that came through his shop, assessing, calculating, already decided. Her father stood beside him and said, "This is your husband. You are leaving today." Nara stood up. "No," she said. "You have no say in this," her father said. "He has 3 wives," she said. "The whole village knows what he is. You cannot. You have 1 arm," her father said. "You are an Omega with 1 arm in a house that cannot afford to keep you. You do not get to choose." He looked at Torin. "She is ready." "I am not going," Nara said. Torin reached out and grabbed her by the hair. She fought. She used every part of her body that still worked, her feet, her right hand, her voice, and none of it made any difference because he was 3 times her size and completely unbothered by any of it. And her father stood in the doorway with his arms folded and watched, and her mother turned and faced the wall. Eid launched himself across the room. Her father caught him by the arm and held him, and Eid was screaming her name and reaching for her, and there was nothing either of them could do, and Torin dragged her through the door and across the yard and threw her up onto the cart like something he had purchased and climbed up beside her and snapped the reins. The last thing she saw before the cart turned the corner was Eid in the yard with their father's hand on his shoulder, still reaching toward the road with everything he had. And then the corner came and he was gone. And the road stretched ahead of her toward a house that smelled of blood and a man she had not chosen and a life her father had decided she deserved. She faced forward. She did not make a sound. Chapter 2. Torin's house sat at the end of the South Road behind a low wooden gate that groaned when he pushed it open. The smell hit her before she climbed down from the cart, blood and raw meat and something underneath both that had soaked itself into the walls and the yard and the ground beneath her feet over years of living there. 3 women appeared in the doorway of the house as they approached and watched Nara with tired flat eyes and said nothing and disappeared back inside before Torin had finished tying the cart horse. He pushed the door open and walked in without looking back to see if she was following. She followed because there was nowhere else to go. The house was large and cluttered, and every surface had something on it that had no business being there. Torin moved through it with the comfort of a man who had never once questioned his right to take up space and fill it however he pleased. He showed her nothing. He simply walked to the back of the house and opened a door and stood aside and looked at her with those small flat eyes and waited. She walked past him into the room. It was small. A bed, a window, a lamp burning low on a shelf. She heard him come in behind her and heard the door close and heard the particular quality of silence that followed it. "I have been watching you at the market for 2 years," he said. She turned around. He was already pulling his shirt over his head with the unhurried ease of a man who had done this many times before and found nothing remarkable about it. He dropped the shirt on the floor and looked at her with a slow satisfaction that made her skin crawl from the inside out. "I told your father a long time ago that I wanted you," he said, moving toward the lamp and turning it lower. "He said you were not available." "Too proud," he said. "Too much trouble." He looked at her arm and smiled. "Look how things change." "Stay where you are," Nara said. He kept moving. "You are my wife," he said pleasantly. "You will get used to it." "I said stay where you are." He crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward the bed, and she did the only thing left available to her. She turned her head and bit down on his hand with everything she had. He screamed. She ran. Through the door, through the cluttered house, past the 3 wives who appeared from doorways and pressed themselves against walls as she came through, out the front door and across the yard and through the groaning gate and into the south road and off the south road and into the trees, and she ran until the lights of his house were gone and the dark had closed around her completely and her lungs were burning and her legs were shaking and she had no idea where she was or where she was going, and it did not matter because forward was the only direction that existed for her now. She ran until she couldn't. She stopped against a large tree with her hand pressed flat against the bark and her chest heaving and the dark forest pressing in on every side and the silence enormous around her. She breathed. She let her legs stop shaking. She pushed off the tree and started walking because stopping was not something she knew how to do for long. That was when she heard it. Small. Close. The sound of something in pain. A high thin cry that cut through the forest silence and stopped and started again, and she slowed without deciding to because that sound was not something she could walk past regardless of what was chasing her or what lay ahead of her or how little she had left. She found him 10 steps off the path. A wolf pup. Small enough to fit in one arm, which was all she had to offer him. He was on his side in the roots of a large tree with a wound on his back leg that was deep enough to be serious, and he was trembling all over with the specific exhausted trembling of something that had been frightened and hurt for too long and had run out of the energy to keep being either. He cried when he saw her and she crouched down immediately and made herself small and kept her voice very low and very steady. "I know," she said quietly. "I know. It's all right. I'm not going to hurt you." He cried again and tried to pull away and couldn't because the leg wouldn't hold him, and she stayed exactly where she was and kept talking low and steady until the trembling slowed and the crying quieted, and he was looking at her with large amber eyes that were still frightened but had decided, very tentatively, that she was not the worst option currently available to him. She found the leaves she needed without going far. She had learned plants and their uses the way she had learned everything, alone and out of necessity. And she pressed them carefully against the wound and tore a strip from the hem of her dress with her teeth and her one hand and bound it as well as she could manage. The pup held still through all of it, watching her face with those amber eyes, and by the time she was done he had his nose pressed against her hand and his trembling had stopped almost entirely. She sat back on her heels and looked at him in the dark. "Better," she said softly. He made a small sound. She saw the torchlight before she heard them. Orange light moving through the trees from multiple directions at once, spreading through the dark like something being drawn closed around her. She pulled the pup against her chest and got to her feet and looked for a gap in the approaching light and found none and pressed back against the tree and made herself as small as she could and knew it would not be enough. Something moved to her right. Fast and certain and completely silent, and a hand closed around her arm before she had processed that anyone was there. She looked up. He was standing directly in front of her. No torch. He didn't need one. The torchlight from his men moving through the trees behind him caught the line of his jaw and the width of his shoulders and his dark eyes looking down at her with an expression so cold and so completely unreadable that she forgot for one full second that she had been about to run. It was the man from the market square. Alpha Cress. He looked at her face. He looked at the pup pressed against her chest. Something moved through his eyes, there and gone, and he said nothing. Behind him one of his men pushed through the trees and stopped, and his torch swept across the scene and landed on the pup in Nara's arms, and the man said in a voice that came out completely stripped of its composure, "Alpha. She has the prince." The words moved through the group of men like a current, low urgent voices, movement, everyone pressing forward at once. Crest did not move. He looked at the pup one moment longer and then reached out and took him from Nara's arms carefully, his large hands closing around the small, trembling body with a gentleness that had no business existing in the same hands that had silenced an entire market square without raising his voice. The pup went to him without protest. Cress looked at Nara. She tried to speak. The ground came up to meet her, and then she collapsed. Chapter 3. She woke up in a bed that was not hers. Nara sat up immediately, scanning the room before she was fully conscious. Stone walls, high ceiling, a window with morning light coming through it, a fire burning low in the corner, a healer sitting beside the bed who startled when she moved and put both hands out. "Easy," the healer said. "You are safe. Lie back down." "Where am I?" Nara said. "The Alpha's pack house." "Lie down." She did not lie down. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood up, and the room tilted briefly, and she held the bedpost with her one hand and waited for it to stop. The healer was talking, about rest, about recovery, about the state she had been in when they brought her in, and she listened to none of it because she was too busy counting doors and windows and calculating distances. One door. One window. Fire on the left wall. Bed against the right. She was not a prisoner. The door was not locked. She could see that from where she was standing. She sat back down on the edge of the bed and breathed and let the healer finish talking. A servant came with food and clothing, both finer than anything Nara had worn or eaten in her life. She put the clothing on because hers was destroyed, and she ate because she had not eaten since the morning before and her body had stopped asking politely. The servant was a young woman who moved efficiently and smiled carefully and answered Nara's questions in the specific way of someone who had been told what to say and was saying it. She asked if she was a prisoner. The servant smiled carefully and collected the empty bowl and left. Nara pulled the sleeve of the clean dress down over her left arm and went to find out where she was. The pack house was enormous. She moved through corridors that were wider than her father's entire house, past rooms with open doors showing furniture and light and the quiet organized life of a household that ran on money and authority and order. She was trying to find her way back to the room she had woken up in when she turned a corner and walked directly into a sold. The woman was tall and auburn-haired and immediately, completely, the most beautiful person Nara had encountered in a space this size. She looked at Nara with pale green eyes and a warm smile that arrived on her face so quickly and so perfectly that it took Nara a full second to feel what was underneath it. "You must be the girl Cress brought in from the forest," Isolde said. Her voice was warm and smooth and completely deliberate. Her eyes moved over Nara from the top of her head to her feet and back up again, pausing once at her left arm where the sleeve covered the wrist, and the smile didn't change but something behind it did. "We were all very worried about you. You gave everyone quite a scare." Nara looked at her steadily. "Thank you," she said. "Of course." Isolde tilted her head. "The maids' quarters are on the lower floor. Third door on the left when you reach the bottom of the stairs. You'll want to get yourself settled." She smiled one more time, warm, complete, landing exactly where she intended it to land, and walked away down the corridor without waiting for a response. Nara stood where she was and watched her go. She turned a corner looking for the stairs and almost walked directly into Cress. They stopped. Face to face in the corridor with barely 2 steps between them. He was taller than she had registered in the forest and in the market square, broader, more present, filling the corridor in a way that had nothing to do with his size and everything to do with whatever it was he carried in the quality of his stillness. He looked at her the way he had looked at her in both places before, direct and steady and giving nothing away, and she looked back at him with her chin level and her sleeve pulled down and her face arranged into the expression she wore when she needed people to believe she was fine. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Fine," she said. "I want to leave." "You are free to go," he said. "Whenever you choose." She held his gaze. He held hers. She opened her mouth to say something and closed it again because she had just remembered simultaneously that she had no home to go to, no family that wanted her back, and a husband on the South Road who was going to be looking for her, and the word leave had nowhere to point. He said nothing. He simply looked at her with those dark steady eyes and waited. She stepped to the side to let him pass. He walked by her and continued down the corridor, and she stood there alone and breathed and stared at the wall and accepted the reality of her situation in the specific silence of someone who had run out of options and knew it. She found the garden by accident. It was at the back of the pack house, a wide open space with stone paths and low walls and a large tree in the center that had clearly been old for a very long time. She sat down at the base of it with her back against the bark and her knees pulled up and tried to think clearly about what came next. She was still sitting there when Tam found her. He came around the side of the house and stopped when he saw her. 6 years old, serious-faced, dark-eyed, standing completely still at the edge of the garden looking at her the way children looked at things they had already decided about and were simply confirming. She looked back at him and said nothing. He walked across the garden and sat down beside her against the tree without being invited and without saying a word. They sat in silence for a long time. She could feel him thinking beside her the way children thought, completely and without self-consciousness, everything happening on his face. Then he opened his hand in her lap. A smooth stone. Small. Pale. Nothing remarkable about it except that he had been carrying it and had decided she should have it. He folded her fingers over it with both his small hands and looked up at her very seriously with Cressa's eyes in a child's face. She looked down at the stone in her hand. The tight thing in her chest loosened in a way she had not been prepared for, and she pressed her lips together and held the stone and stayed where she was and stopped thinking about leaving. The shouting reached them 20 minutes later. Torin's voice carried easily over the pack house walls, loud and entitled and completely convinced of its own authority. Nara went still the moment she heard it. Every muscle in her body made a decision simultaneously. Tam looked up at her face and without saying anything slid his hand into hers and held on. Guards moved toward the front gate. Then Cress appeared from inside the house, unhurried, straightening his sleeve as he walked, and crossed to the gate and stood there and looked at Torin. Whatever he said was too quiet to carry to the garden. Torin's voice got louder for a few more seconds and then stopped. The gate closed. Cress walked back inside without looking toward the garden. Tam looked up at her. "He won't come back," he said. She looked down at him and said nothing. But she believed him. 2 days later her father came. She saw him from the window of the lower corridor, standing at the gate with his chest out and his voice already carrying before anyone had come to receive him. He had heard. Of course he had heard. And he had not come to see if she was safe or if she was whole or if she had eaten or slept or survived the forest and everything before it. He had come because there was money to be made from where his daughter had ended up, and he had never once in his life walked past money. Cress came out. Her father talked. She watched from the window and could not hear the words, but she did not need to hear them because she knew her father's face when he was asking for something, and she knew exactly what he was asking for. Cress went inside. He came back with a bag of coins and threw it at her father's feet. It landed in the dirt at his boots, and her father looked at it for half a second and then crouched down and picked it up with both hands, and his face opened with a satisfaction so complete and so undisguised that Nara had to look away from the window because she could not watch it and keep herself together simultaneously. When she looked back, her father was already walking away down the road. He did not look back at the house. He did not ask to see her. He did not say her name. He turned the corner and was gone. Tam was standing beside her at the window. She had not heard him come. He looked up at her face and then looked back at the empty road and slid his hand into hers and held it with both of his and leaned his small weight against her side. She looked down at the top of his head. She breathed once, slowly, and held his hand and said nothing at all. That evening a servant came to tell her the Alpha wanted to see her in his study. She followed the servant down the long corridor and stopped outside the door and went in when it opened and found Cress standing at the window with his back to her. He turned and looked at her directly. "You will stay," he said. You will be given work in this house and you will be treated fairly. He paused. Do you understand? Yes, she said. He nodded and turned back to the window. She turned to leave and had her hand on the door when he said, without turning around, What is your name? She stopped. Nara, she said. He said nothing more. She went out and closed the door and stood in the corridor with her back against the wall and her hand still on the door handle and breathed slowly and told herself that the way her name had sounded in that room was not something she needed to think about. She thought about it anyway. Chapter 4. Isolde's assignments came through the head servant every morning, written on a small piece of paper in neat handwriting that was too careful to be casual. That morning the paper said, Upper corridor linens, kitchen stores inventory, yard water collection, stable cleaning. For tasks that would have been unremarkable for anyone else. For a woman with one hand they were designed with a precision that Nara recognized and said nothing about. She started with the linens. The pile was heavy and awkward and she had developed a way of carrying things like this, tucked against her body, her one arm holding the bulk of it, her chin helping to balance the top, that worked if nothing unexpected happened. She was moving down the upper corridor at a steady pace when she turned the corner and walked directly into Cress coming the other way. The pile shifted. She felt it going and there was nothing she could do with one hand to stop it and she braced for the weight of it hitting the floor. It didn't hit the floor. His hands caught it, both of them, fast and certain, taking the bulk of the load before it fell. They were suddenly very close. Both of them holding the same pile of linens in the middle of the corridor, close enough that she could see the exact line of his jaw and the way his dark eyes moved to her face with that direct unhurried attention that she was learning was simply how he looked at everything. She took the pile back. Both hands, his large tan ones and her one, adjusting the weight between them for one brief second before she had it fully and stepped back. Thank you, she said, to a point slightly past his left shoulder. She walked away. She did not look back. But she felt him standing there in the corridor behind her and she did not hear him move for a long moment after she had turned the corner. Tam found her in the garden at mid-morning. He came around the side of the house and walked directly to where she was working without any of the hesitation that most people brought to approaching her, no eyes going to her arm, no careful adjustment of expression, no performance of not noticing. He simply sat down beside her in the dirt and picked up the nearest thing and began helping with the complete confidence of a child who had decided his presence was welcome and saw no reason to seek confirmation. His help was terrible. He was enthusiastic and committed and completely ineffective and she let him do it anyway because the alternative was sending him away and she was not going to do that. They worked in silence for a while. Then Tam started talking. He talked the way 6-year-olds talked when they had found someone they trusted, without editing, without structure, moving from one thing to the next with a logic that was entirely his own. He told her about the cook who burned the morning bread every third day without fail. He told her about the guard at the east gate who fell asleep standing up and had been doing it for years and everyone knew and nobody said anything. He told her that Cress drank his tea without anything in it and that this was wrong and that he had told him so many times. She laughed at that. It came out before she could decide about it. Tam looked at her with large serious eyes. It is wrong, he said, completely earnest. You are right, she said. It is completely wrong. He nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose position had been validated by an authority and went back to his terrible helping. She kept working and let him talk and listened to everything he said and remembered all of it. She felt Cress before she saw him. A shift in the quality of the garden's quiet, not a sound, just a change, the way a room changed when someone entered it who carried a particular kind of weight. She kept her eyes on her work. Tam was in the middle of telling her something about a horse in the eastern stable when he looked up and his whole face changed. Cress, he said, and scrambled to his feet. She looked up. Cress was leaning against the garden wall with his arms folded and his dark eyes on both of them. He had been there long enough to have watched without announcing himself and his expression was doing something she hadn't seen on it before. Not the controlled cold blank. Something quieter than that. Something that had no guard up because he hadn't known he needed one. Tam ran to him and grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the garden talking at full speed about everything they had been doing, and Cress let himself be pulled and crouched down to Tam's level and listened with his full attention the way he gave everything his full attention. While he was crouched down, his eyes moved to Nara's face. She was already looking at the garden wall. She picked up her work and kept going and heard Tam's voice carrying across the garden and heard Cress's low responses and did not look back. But she was aware of him the way she was aware of things that required managing, steadily, carefully, without letting the awareness show on her face. She heard him stand. She heard his footsteps cross the garden. She thought he was leaving, and then the footsteps stopped beside her and she looked up and he was crouching down to her level the way he had crouched to Tam's, looking at what she was doing with those direct, steady eyes. "The south beds," he said. "The soil is harder there. It needs more water before you work it." She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He held her gaze for one moment and then stood and walked back toward Tam, and she turned back to her work and breathed slowly and told herself that the warmth in her face was from the morning sun and nothing else. She found Cora sitting in the garden after they had gone, small and still among the plants as though she had grown there, her sharp eyes moving over everything with the attention of someone who missed nothing and forgot less. Nara sat beside her without being invited. Cora looked at her with eyes that already knew what kind of morning she had been having and said nothing about it. Then she reached out and took Nara's left arm. Not her right. Her left. The one she always covered. The one nobody touched. She took it in both her old hands and held it and looked at it, at the sleeve covering the wrist, at the shape of the arm beneath the fabric, with eyes that carried no pity and no flinching and no performance of not noticing. Just seeing. Just acknowledging. The way people looked at things they had already accepted completely. "This did not make you less," Cora said. "It made you more." Nara looked at the garden wall. She breathed very carefully through her nose and kept her face exactly as it was. Cora released her arm and went back to her plants. "He watches you," she said, in the same tone she might have used to remark on the weather. "He watches everything," Nara said. Cora smiled at her plants and said nothing more. That evening a servant collapsed in the lower corridor. The pack healer came quickly and crouched beside the woman and asked his questions and produced his medicine with the quiet efficiency of a man who had seen this before, because he had, many times, for 5 years, and the medicine he produced was the same medicine he always produced, and it helped the way it always helped, which was partially and temporarily and not enough. Nara stood in the corridor doorway and watched. She watched the healer's hands. She watched the sick woman's face. She watched the medicine being measured and administered, and she looked at it with eyes that were working on something she hadn't finished thinking yet, a connection forming at the edge of her understanding that she couldn't quite reach. She had seen something. In the garden. In the plants Cora kept. Something that didn't fit with what the healer was doing, and she couldn't yet say why it didn't fit, but it didn't. She filed it away and said nothing. She was finishing the last of her work in the kitchen late that night when she heard Tam. The sound came from the upper floor, sustained and frightened, and the specific quality of a child deep in a nightmare with no way out of it. She was moving before she had decided to move, up the stairs and down the corridor and through his door, and she was beside his bed with her hand on his back before she had thought about whether this was her place to be. "Tam," she said quietly. "I am here. You are safe." He was calling a name. Over and over. A woman's name that was not Cress's name and was not anyone in this house. His mother's name. She knew it without being told. She kept her hand on his back and kept her voice low and steady and talked to him the way she had always talked to Eve through bad nights, not trying to pull him out of it forcefully, just being a steady presence at the edge of it until he found his way back on his own. Slowly the crying quieted. His breathing changed. His eyes opened and found her face in the dark, and he looked at her for a long moment and then reached out and grabbed her hand and held it with both of his and closed his eyes again. She stayed. She did not hear the door. She did not hear the footsteps. She felt the change in the room the way she always felt when Cress entered a space she was in, and she turned her head and found him standing in the doorway looking at his sister's son asleep with her hand held in both of his. He looked at Tam. He looked at her. His face in the dark was doing something she didn't have the language for, and she didn't try to find it. She turned back to Tam and said nothing. She heard Cress cross the room. She thought he was going to take her place beside Tam and she started to move, but he didn't take her place. He walked to the other side of the bed and sat down against the wall and closed his eyes. Not leaving. Just staying. The three of them in the dark room, Tam between them, both of them awake, neither of them speaking, and the fire burning low in the corner and the night pressing against the window and nothing that needed to be said finding a way to be said. She held Tam's hand and looked at the wall and breathed slowly and did not look at Cress again. But she knew he was there. And that was the problem. Chapter 5. She woke up against the side of Tam's bed with a blanket over her shoulders. She sat up slowly and looked at it. It was not hers. She had not put it there. She looked across the room at the empty chair in the corner where Cress had been sitting when she last remembered being awake, and then she looked back at the blanket and sat with that for a moment. Tam was breathing deeply beside her, his fever broken, his face finally slack and peaceful in sleep. She stood carefully so as not to wake him and folded the blanket and set it on the end of his bed and smoothed it flat with her one hand and stood there looking at it a moment longer than was necessary. Then she went to the door and opened it and stepped into the corridor. Isolde was there. She was walking toward the far end of the corridor and stopped when Nara came out of the room and turned and looked at her with those pale green eyes and took in exactly where she was coming from and what that meant, and her face did something that lasted less than a second before the warmth came back and settled perfectly into place. Early morning, Isolde said pleasantly. He had a fever, Nara said. Of course. Isolde's eyes moved once to Tam's door and back to Nara's face. You are very dedicated. She smiled. We are lucky to have you. She turned and continued down the corridor and her footsteps faded and she was gone and the corridor was empty and quiet, and Nara stood outside Tam's door and looked at the space where Isolde had been standing and understood clearly that something had just been noted and filed and would be used when the time was right. She went downstairs and started her work. She was in the lower garden at mid-morning when she heard him come through the gate behind her. She knew it was him before she turned around. She had learned the particular quality of his footsteps over the weeks she had been in this house: deliberate, unhurried, evenly spaced, the footsteps of a man who had never once needed to rush because the world arranged itself around his pace. She kept her eyes on what she was doing, and he came and crouched beside her without asking permission and without announcing himself and picked up the nearest tool and began helping with what she was working on. She looked at him sideways. He looked at the soil and kept working. They worked in silence for a while. The garden was warm and the morning was quiet and the sounds of the pack house went on around them at a comfortable distance, and she found, to her own irritation, that she was not uncomfortable. She was almost never not uncomfortable. She had spent 5 years being uncomfortable in every space she occupied because every space she occupied had made clear in one way or another that her presence in it was conditional and provisional and subject to revision. This was different and she did not know what to do with the difference. Where did you learn to do this? Cress said. She looked at him. The garden? The healing, he said. Tam's fever last night. The pup in the forest. The way you work with plants. He looked at her directly. Where did you learn it? She turned back to the soil. My mother knew plants, she said. Before she decided other things were more important. She paused. I taught myself the rest. How old were you when you started? He said. She thought about it. 9, she said. Maybe 10. He looked at her face. She kept her eyes on the soil and kept working and felt his gaze the way she always felt it, steadily, from the inside, like something warm pressing against the back of her ribs. What else do you know? He said. She looked at him then. He was watching her with his full attention in the way he watched everything, completely, without self-consciousness, like whatever she was about to say was the only thing happening in the world right now. She had never had anyone's full attention before. Not like this. She had had people's eyes but not their attention. There was a difference, and she had learned it early and had stopped expecting the real thing a long time ago. She looked back at the garden and said, more than I have had occasion to use. He said nothing. He kept working beside her and she kept working beside him, and the morning went on around them and she let herself be in it without pulling away from it, which was the closest thing to peace she had felt in a very long time. Tam's fever came on in the afternoon. It arrived fast the way childhood fevers did. One moment he was running through the lower corridor and the next he was flushed and heavy-eyed and miserable and refusing everything the servants tried to do for him with the focused stubbornness of a sick 6-year-old who had decided he did not want what was being offered. The pack healer came and tried. Tam turned his face away from him and called Nara's name. The healer tried again. Tam called her name louder. Cress stood in the doorway of the room with his arms folded and his jaw tight and watched his nephew refuse 4 different people in a row and call for one specific person with a certainty that left no room for negotiation. Nara came. Tam stopped fighting the moment she sat beside him. Not dramatically, he simply stopped, the way a body stopped fighting when it had found what it needed and could redirect its energy toward getting better instead. She put her hand on his forehead and spoke to him low, and he looked at her with glassy, unhappy eyes and let her work. She managed him through the afternoon and into the evening with cool cloths and water and the quiet, focused patience of someone who understood that this kind of thing could not be rushed and did not try to rush it. She talked to him when he was awake, low and easy, about nothing important, just her voice filling the room with something steady, and sat quietly when he slept and checked him regularly and adjusted what she was doing based on what she found. Cress sat in the chair in the corner and did not leave. She was aware of him the entire time. Every hour of it. The particular quality of his stillness in that chair and the weight of his attention moving between Tam and her and back again, and the silence between them that was full of things neither of them was going to say in a room with a sick child and probably not outside of one either. She kept her eyes on Tam and her hands steady and her face exactly as it needed to be. Toward dawn Tam's fever broke. She felt it in his skin before she saw it in his face, the heat pulling back, the tension in his small body releasing, his breathing deepening and slowing into something genuine and restful. He slipped from fitful half-sleep into real sleep between one breath and the next, and she sat back and exhaled and dropped her head into her hand and closed her eyes. She was so tired her bones felt heavy. She heard Cress get up from the chair. She heard him cross the room. She thought he was going to check on Tam and she started to open her eyes and sit up straight, and he crouched directly in front of her instead, close, his face level with hers, and she opened her eyes and found him right there with his dark eyes on her face. She went very still. He reached out and pushed the hair from her face. One slow deliberate motion, his fingers moving the strands back from her cheek, and she sat completely still and breathed and looked at him and held every single thing she was feeling in both hands like something she could not afford to drop. He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. Quietly. 2 words with the full weight of his attention behind them. She did not respond. She could not respond. She looked at him and breathed, and he held her gaze, and then he stood and walked back to the chair and sat down and closed his eyes, and the room went quiet again. She turned back to Tam. She sat with her hand resting near his and stared at the wall and told herself very firmly that she was a maid and an omega and a woman with one arm whose own father had sold her for a bag of coins, and that whatever she was feeling in this room needed to be put down immediately and walked away from. She did not put it down. She did not see Isolde go into Cress's study that morning. She did not hear the conversation, the carefully measured concern, the warm framing, the precise words chosen by a woman who knew the man she was speaking to well enough to know exactly which words would land and how. She did not hear Isolde talk about Tam's attachment or about appropriateness or about the complications of a maid occupying spaces in this house that were above her position. She did not hear any of it. She came around the corner of the upper corridor 20 minutes after it was over and saw Isolde walking away from Cress's study with that perfect warm smile sitting on her face and her shoulders carrying the specific relaxed quality of someone who had just done something they had been planning for a while and had done it well. Isolde turned and saw her. The smile didn't change. "Good morning, Nara," she said pleasantly. "How is the boy?" "Better," Nara said. "Wonderful." Isolde walked past her and was gone. Nara stood alone in the corridor and looked at the closed door of Cress's study and understood, without being told, without hearing a single word of what had happened inside that room, that something had just been done that she was not going to be able to undo. She stood there and breathed. Then she picked up her work and kept going. Because that was the only thing she had ever known how to do. Chapter 6. The announcement came the next morning. Nara was passing through the great hall with a pile of folded cloth when she heard Cress's voice carrying from the front of the room and stopped at the doorway without meaning to. His men were gathered, 20, maybe more, standing in the organized silence of people who had done this before and knew what it meant when their alpha called them together with that particular quality in his voice. Cress stood at the front of the room and told them they were riding out in 2 days to the northern border. Coordinated rogue attacks on 3 pack settlements. Connected to whoever had been using his name to give orders that never came from him. His voice was flat and certain and completely without drama, and his men received it the same way, the quiet nod of people who had already decided a long time ago that wherever he rode they rode with him. Isolde was standing close to him with her hand on his arm and her face arranged into the expression of a woman who had the right to be afraid for someone and was exercising it fully. She leaned close and said something low and private, and Cress listened and said something back, and his expression did not change. Nara looked at his face for 1 moment longer than she meant to. Then she turned and walked away and said nothing to anyone. The next 2 days moved fast. The pack house shifted into a different version of itself. Weapons and provisions and horses and men moving through every corridor with the organized purposeful noise of a household preparing for something serious. Nara worked through all of it. She carried things and cleaned things and organized things and moved around the edges of the preparation the way she moved around the edges of everything in this house, efficiently, quietly, making herself useful without making herself visible. She told herself this had nothing to do with her. She told herself this several times across both days. It did not become more true with repetition. Tam had gone quiet in the way he went quiet when things were happening that he didn't have words for yet. He followed her more than usual and held her hand while they walked through the house and said very little, and she didn't push him to talk. She just let him hold her hand and walked slowly enough that he didn't have to hurry and stayed close enough that he knew she was there. On the evening before Cress was to ride out, she was passing the corridor outside his study when she saw the door was open and Isolde was inside. She was standing very close to him with her hand pressed flat against his chest and her face tilted up toward his and her voice low and private, filling the space between them with something Nara could not hear and did not try to hear. She did not stop walking. She kept moving past the open door at the same pace she had been walking before she saw it, and she went to the kitchen and picked up her work and put the image down firmly and did not pick it up again. She picked it up again continuously for the rest of the evening. The house was quiet by the time she went to the garden. She sat at the base of the large tree with her back against the bark and her knees pulled up and looked at nothing in particular and let the night air sit around her. She heard the garden gate open and looked up, and Cress was there. He stopped when he saw her. He stood at the gate for a moment and she thought he was going to turn around, and she braced for it without meaning to, the specific bracing of someone who had learned not to expect people to stay. He crossed the garden and sat down beside her against the tree. Not across from her. Beside her. Close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the night air. They sat in silence for a long time. The night pressed in around the garden walls and the pack house was quiet behind them, and neither of them looked at the other. Then he said without turning his head, "When I return I want to speak with you about something." She looked at him. His jaw was set and his profile in the dark was giving nothing away, and he was looking at the garden wall with his dark eyes carrying something she did not have the language for. "All right," she said. He nodded. He stayed beside her a little longer, long enough that the silence between them stopped being empty and became something else, something that had weight and warmth and a quality she did not know what to do with, and then he got up and walked back through the garden gate and was gone. She sat alone at the base of the tree and stared at the garden wall and told herself she did not know what that meant. She almost believed it. He rode out before the sun fully rose. The whole pack house was awake, horses and men and the organized controlled noise of departure filling every corridor and spilling out into the yard. Nara stood at the upper window with Tam beside her, his small hand in hers, and watched the yard below fill with riders and then empty again as they moved toward the gate. Cress came out of the house below them last. Dark coat. Armed. Every inch of him the alpha, the way he carried himself, the way his men organized themselves around him without being told, the way the yard went slightly more purposeful the moment he appeared in it. He gave his final instructions to the beta he was leaving in charge, and the beta received them with a nod and stepped back. Cress turned his horse toward the gate. Then he looked up. He found her face in the upper window in the dark before the sun had finished rising, found it directly, without searching, like he had known exactly where to look, and held it for one moment. His expression gave her nothing. But he looked. Directly and deliberately, and for long enough that it could not have been accidental. Then he rode. Nara stood at the window after the sound of the horses had faded completely into the distance, and Tam's hand was still in hers, and the yard below was empty and quiet, and the morning was coming in gray and cold over the pack house walls. "He will come back," Tam said. He said it the way he said things he had already decided were facts. She looked down at him. "I know," she said. She said it like she meant it. She spent the next 3 days trying to keep meaning it. She could not sleep. The first night she lay on her mat and stared at the ceiling and told herself she was tired and her body needed rest, and none of that made any difference. The second night she gave up trying and sat in the garden with Cora until the old woman told her gently to go inside and sleep, and she went inside and did not sleep. The third night she sat alone in the garden after Cora had gone to bed and pressed her one hand flat against her chest and looked at the dark sky above the garden walls and prayed. She was not someone who prayed easily. She had spent too many years asking for things that did not come to make a habit of asking. But she sat in the dark with her hand on her chest and asked the goddess quietly and without ceremony to bring him back. Just that. Just bring him back. She did not dress it up or explain herself or apologize for wanting it. She just asked and meant it completely, and sat with the asking in the dark until the cold got into her bones and she went inside. The sound of horses reached the pack house on the afternoon of the 4th day. Nara was in the lower corridor with a pile of linens when she heard it, the distant sound of hooves on the road outside the walls growing closer, the gate guards calling out, the pack house erupting into movement around her. She stood completely still in the middle of the corridor and listened, and felt something move through her chest that she had been holding back for 4 days and had no name for and no permission to feel. She put the linens down. She walked to the great hall and stopped in the doorway and looked in, and he was there. Alive. Present. Filling the room the way he always filled rooms, with that particular weight that had nothing to do with his size and everything to do with whatever it was he carried. He was talking to his men, giving orders, his dark coat dusty from the road and his jaw unshaven and his dark eyes moving around the room with the sharp focused attention of a man doing several things simultaneously. He was completely, entirely, undeniably there. Something unknotted in her chest so suddenly and so completely that she had to put her hand on the doorframe. She almost walked into the room. She stopped herself at the last moment, her foot already moving, her body already leaning forward, and pulled back and stood in the doorway and breathed and looked at him from the distance of the hall and told herself everything she needed to tell herself. She was a maid. An Omega. A woman with one arm whose own father had sold her for a bag of coins and walked away without saying her name. She had no business feeling what she was feeling in this doorway. She had no business wanting to cross this room. He had not looked at her. He did not know she was standing here. She was invisible in this room the way she was invisible in every room that was not meant for her, and that was exactly as it should be. She picked up the linens. She went back to work. That evening the pack celebrated. The great hall was loud and warm and full, food and drink and the released tension of men who had ridden into something dangerous and ridden back out again. Nara moved through it with plates and cups, working her way across the hall and back, keeping her eyes on what she was carrying and her feet on the path between the kitchen and the tables, and her face arranged into the blank useful expression she wore when she needed to be invisible. Cress was at the head of the room. Isolde was beside him with her hand on his arm and her face bright with relief, and he was receiving his men and his counsel with the controlled ease of a man who was good at being the center of a room even when he did not particularly want to be. Nara kept her eyes on her plates. She was almost through the hall when the hand closed around her wrist. Not rough. Firm and certain and completely deliberate, pulling her sideways out of the flow of the celebration and into the narrow corridor beside the hall before she had fully processed what was happening. She spun around and he was right there in the dim corridor with his dark eyes on her face and his hands still around her wrist and the noise of the celebration going on behind the wall beside them like it belonged to a completely different world. She stared at him. He took the plates from her hand and set them on the floor without looking at them and straightened and looked at her, and the corridor was very quiet and very close and his eyes were doing something she had no framework for, open, direct, completely decided. He put his hand against the wall beside her head and leaned close and kissed her. She went completely still. Everything she had ever believed about what she was worth and who would ever choose her pressed against the inside of her chest all at once, her father's face picking up the coins, Isolde's voice in the corridor telling her she could not be what he needed, the night on the floor of her family's house holding what was left of her arm and telling her brother she was all right. All of it pressing against her chest telling her this could not be real and she should not believe it and she should pull back before it cost her something she could not afford to lose. She kissed him back. He went still for one brief second, the stillness of a man who had prepared himself for resistance and did not know what to do with the absence of it. And then his hand moved from the wall to her face and she stopped thinking about everything she had been thinking about and was simply there, in the corridor, with him. He pulled back and looked at her face in the dim light with his dark eyes moving across her features and his hands still warm against her jaw. "I know you feel it," he said quietly. "I have known for a long time." His thumb moved once across her cheek. "Do not hold back from me, Nara." She looked at him. At his face. At the complete certainty sitting in his dark eyes without apology or performance or any of the conditions she had learned to expect from people who said they wanted things from her. "You don't know what you are choosing," she said. "I know exactly what I am choosing," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. All of it pressing against her chest, everything she had been told she was, everything she had been told she was worth, the arms she hid under her sleeve, the family that sold her, the years of making herself small enough to fit in spaces that were never meant for her. She looked at his face and let it press and then she breathed out slowly and let it go. And she stopped holding back. Isolde came around the corner of the corridor 40 seconds later and stopped. She saw them. Everything she had been building since the day Nara arrived, every carefully chosen word, every sweet smile, every assignment designed to diminish, every conversation in Cress's study framed as loyalty and concern, all of it visible in her face for one unguarded second as she stood at the end of the corridor and looked at the two of them against the wall. Then she put it back. Every piece of it, back behind the warm composed surface she wore like a second skin, until her face showed nothing that could be used against her. She turned and walked away without a sound. Neither Cress nor Nara heard her come. Neither of them heard her go. But the audience did. And the audience understood that what Isolde had just seen was not something she was going to absorb quietly. Something was coming. Chapter 7. She woke up with the night before sitting in her chest like something that had changed the furniture while she was sleeping, everything in the same place but nothing quite where she remembered leaving it. She got up. She pulled her sleeve down over her left wrist. She went to work. She moved through the morning with her face exactly as it needed to be and her hands doing what her hands always did and her mind doing the thing it did when she needed to manage something, putting it in a room, closing the door, attending to what was in front of her. The corridor. The linens. The kitchen. The yard. One thing and then the next thing and then the thing after that. It almost worked. He found her in the lower corridor before the house was fully awake. She heard his footsteps and knew them and kept her eyes on what she was doing, and he stopped beside her and she looked up and he was looking at her face with those dark steady eyes in the specific way he had of looking at things he had already decided about. He said her name. Just that. Quietly. The way he had said it in his study on her first night in this house, with his full attention behind it, like it was the only word in the room. She looked at him and said nothing, and he looked at her a moment longer and then turned and walked away toward his morning duties, and she stood alone in the corridor and pressed her one hand flat against the wall and breathed slowly until the feeling in her chest settled into something manageable. It did not settle into something manageable. She went back to work. She did not know about the council meeting until mid-morning. The head servant found her in the lower corridor and came close and spoke in a low voice that was trying very hard to be neutral and was not quite succeeding. She said there had been a meeting that morning. She said it had been called before Cress was awake. She said Nara's name had been mentioned and pack law had been invoked and the council was going to make a ruling and she thought Nara should know. Then she straightened and walked away because she had said what she came to say and could not afford to say more. Nara stood in the corridor. She stood there for a long moment with the head servant's words settling into her chest on top of everything else that was already there, and she thought about pack law, about what it said and what it had always said and what it was always going to say about a woman like her. An Omega. One arm. No rank. No family that would stand for her. Bought twice and worth whatever the last man had been willing to pay. She went back to work. Because that was what she did. Because the corridor needed to be swept and the linens needed to be folded and the world kept requiring things of her regardless of what was happening inside her chest, and she had never once in her life made the world wait while she fell apart. She was not going to start today. Tam found her in the kitchen. He came around the door and stopped and looked at her face with those serious dark eyes that missed nothing and said nothing for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and sat down beside her on the bench and looked at his hands. "Are you going to leave?" he said. She looked at him. At the side of his face, Cress's jaw and a child's face, his mother's eyes, the specific serious quality of a boy who had grown up around loss and had learned to see it coming before it arrived. "I don't know, Tam," she said. He reached out and took her hand, her right hand, the whole one, and held it with both of his and looked at the kitchen wall and said nothing more. She sat beside him and let him hold her hand and looked at the same wall and said nothing more either. That was enough. That was all either of them had right now, and it was enough. Cress's beta found him in his study at midday. He came in and closed the door behind him and stood in front of the desk with the expression of a man who had been deciding how to say something for the last hour and had arrived at the conclusion that there was no good way and was simply going to say it. He told him about the council meeting. He told him who had called it. He told him what had been said and what law had been invoked and what ruling the council was preparing to make. Cress sat behind his desk and listened without moving. When the beta finished, the room was very quiet. Cress looked at the surface of the desk in front of him and said nothing for a long moment. The beta had been beside him for 15 years. He had seen him negotiate with one hand and destroy with the other without changing his expression. He had seen him ride into 3 border wars without flinching. He had seen him sit in that chair on the night he lost everyone and hold his dead sister's baby and make decisions that needed making before the sun rose. He had never seen this particular stillness on him. It was not the cold, controlled stillness he wore every day, the managed, deliberate, chosen stillness of a man who had decided long ago that the world would see exactly what he allowed it to see and nothing more. This was something underneath that. Something that had been reached at a level the control did not cover. "Who else was in the room?" Cress said. The beta told him. Cress stood up. He straightened his coat. He walked to the door and opened it and went out, and the beta stood alone in the study and looked at the empty doorway and said nothing because there was nothing to say. He found Isolde in the upper corridor. She saw him coming and her chin lifted and her shoulders went back and she looked at him with those pale green eyes and waited. She had known him long enough to know what this version of his face meant, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. He stopped in front of her and looked at her and said quietly, "You went to the council." "I did," she said. "You invoked pack law," he said. "It is the law, Cress," she said. "I did not write it. I simply reminded them of it." "You reminded them of it," he said. His voice was very quiet. The specific quiet that his pack had learned over 15 years meant they were in the most dangerous version of his presence. "You went to the council behind my back and invoked a law against a woman in my house while I was sleeping, and you are telling me you were simply reminding them." "I did it for you," she said. "You did it for yourself," he said. The warmth left her face. Not the composed warmth she wore for the world, all of it. The warmth she had been performing and the warmth that was real underneath it and everything in between. It left completely, and what was underneath was not cruelty. It was not calculation. It was grief, old and genuine, and the specific grief of a woman who had loved someone for a very long time and had just watched him say out loud what she had been trying not to hear for years. "I have loved you since we were children," she said. Her voice was steady. She was not going to cry in this corridor, and she had decided that before he arrived. I have been here. Every year. Every loss. Every morning you woke up alone, and every night you went to bed the same way. I have been here, Cress. And you chose her. A woman you have known for weeks. A maid. An Omega with. Be very careful, he said. She stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something so quiet it was almost gentle, and was not gentle at all. I know what you have given, he said. I know how long you have been here, and I know what it cost you, and I am not dismissing that. But what you did this morning cannot be undone with the reason you did it. You went to the council to remove her. Not to protect me. To remove her. He held her gaze. And I need you to understand that it will not work. He walked past her down the corridor. She stood alone and looked at the wall and held herself together with both hands and said nothing because there was nothing left to say. He found Nara in the garden as the light was going. She was sitting at the base of the large tree with her back against the bark and her knees pulled up and her face turned toward the garden wall. She looked up when he came through the gate, and her expression was completely controlled and completely closed, and he could see the effort of that from the other side of the garden, the specific careful blankness of a woman managing something very large and giving it no surface to show itself on. He crossed the garden and crouched in front of her and looked at her directly. I am not going to let them take this from us, he said. She looked at him. You may not have a choice, she said. It is pack law, Cress. It has always been pack law. An Omega with a physical. The law can be answered, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. How? She said. Trust me, he said. She breathed slowly. She looked at his face, at the complete certainty in his dark eyes, the jaw set with something that was not anger and was not fear and was something more permanent than both. She looked at him and said nothing and did not look away. He reached out and took her left arm. Not her right. Her left. The one she always covered. He took it in his hand, his large hand wrapping around the sleeve, not pulling it back, not asking to see anything, just holding it, and looked at her face while he held it. She went very still. He held her gaze and held her arm and said nothing more, and she breathed in slowly and breathed out slowly and let him. He stood. He walked back through the garden gate and was gone. She sat alone at the base of the tree and looked at her left arm where his hand had been and said nothing and felt everything. Cora came to her room that night. She knocked once and came in without waiting for an answer and sat down beside Nara on the edge of the bed and took both her hands in both of hers, the right one and the left one, the whole one and the one that ended before the wrist, and held them both equally without looking at either of them. She looked at Nara's face. There is an old law, she said quietly. Older than this council. Older than the pack law they invoked this morning. A law that has not been used in 30 years because there has been no keeper left alive to invoke it. She paused. Until now. Nara looked at her. What law? She said. Cora looked at her with those sharp knowing eyes that had been seeing things other people missed for longer than most people in this pack had been alive. The law that says what the goddess has joined no council of men has the authority to put asunder. She squeezed Nara's hands once, both of them equally, the right and the left. And I have had eyes, child. I have had eyes since the day you walked into this garden and since long before that. She stood and walked to the door and stopped with her hand on the frame. Be ready, she said. When the time comes you will need to stand in that room and not flinch. She looked back at Nara one more time. Can you do that? Nara looked at her. Yes, she said. Cora nodded and went out and closed the door quietly behind her. Nara sat alone in the dark room and looked at her hands resting in her lap, both of them, the right and the left, and for the first time in 5 years she did not reach for her sleeve to pull it down. She just looked at them. Both of them. Hers. Everything they had done and everything they had cost her and everything they had saved and everything they still had left to do. She sat with them in the dark and breathed and said nothing and let herself be whole. Chapter 8. She woke up quieter than she had woken up in a long time. Not the quiet of exhaustion or the quiet of someone who had given up on something. A different kind, the specific quiet of a person who had sat alone in the dark the night before and looked at something they had been hiding for 5 years and had found that the looking did not destroy them. She lay on her mat for a moment and looked at the ceiling and breathed, and then she got up and dressed and reached for her sleeve out of habit and pulled it down over her left wrist and then stopped. She looked at it. The sleeve. The habit. 5 years of the first thing she did every morning being this: covering, tucking, making sure nothing showed that might make someone look at her differently than she needed them to look at her. She stood there for a long moment. Then she pulled the sleeve back up and went to find Cora. Not yet. But almost. And almost was further than she had been yesterday. Cora was already in the garden when Nara arrived, sitting among her plants in the early morning light with her hands busy and her sharp eyes moving over everything the way they always did, seeing the garden and seeing past it simultaneously. Nara sat beside her and laid everything out. She started with what her mother had taught her before other things became more important. She moved to what she had been watching in the sick servants across the weeks, the progression, the specific way it moved, the thing that the healer's treatment always seemed to address without ever quite reaching. She described the plant on the south wall, why it had come to mind, what her mother used it for, what she thought it was doing that the healer's medicine was not. She talked and Cora listened without interrupting and asked questions when Nara paused, precise, targeted questions that told her the old woman already understood more of this than she had let on. They worked through it together in the garden with the plants between them and the morning light coming up slowly over the pack house walls. Cora pulled certain things from her collection and set them beside the plant from the south wall, and they looked at the combination and talked about it and looked again. By the time the morning was half gone they had something. Not a cure. Not in one sitting, not with certainty. But the beginning of one, the specific thing the healers had been walking past for 5 years because they were looking for something complex, and the answer had been growing wild along the south wall of the pack house the entire time, quiet and unremarkable and waiting for someone to look at it correctly. Cora looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Nara. "Your mother knew things," she said. "She did," Nara said. "Before she decided other things were more important." Cora said nothing more about that. She gathered what they had found and stood up slowly and looked at Nara with those sharp eyes. "I am going to the healer," she said. "He won't like it," Nara said. "No," Cora agreed pleasantly. "He won't." She walked toward the house with her plants in her arms and the specific unbothered certainty of a woman who had been right about things for longer than most people in this pack had been alive and had stopped requiring anyone's permission to act on it. The healer did not like it. Cora came back to the garden an hour later and sat down and reported this without any particular emotion. He had listened. He had asked skeptical questions. He had pointed out that he had been treating this sickness for 5 years and that he did not find it likely that what he had missed would be found by a maid and an old woman in a garden. Cora had been patient and precise and completely unmoved by his skepticism. She had presented what Nara found with the calm authority of someone stating facts rather than making arguments. He had agreed to try it on the sickest servant in the house. "That is all we need," Cora said. She went back to her plants. Nara went back to her work and said nothing and told herself not to think about it until there was something to think about. She thought about it continuously. Cress's beta found him in his study at mid-morning. He came in and stood at the desk and told him what was happening, that Cora and the new maid had brought something to the healer, that the healer was trying it on the sickest patient in the house, that if it worked it would mean someone in his own house had found in a matter of weeks what his healers had been unable to find in 5 years. Cress looked at him. "Who?" he said. "Nara," the beta said. "And Cora." Cress was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the surface of his desk and said nothing, and the beta waited because he had learned long ago that Cress's silences were not empty and filling them was never the right decision. Then Cress stood and walked out of the study. He found her in the lower corridor with a pile of folded cloth. She looked up when she heard him coming and held the pile against her body with her one arm and waited with her face doing the careful neutral thing it did when she wasn't sure what was coming. He stopped in front of her. "The healer tells me you found something," he said. Cora and I found something, she said. We don't know yet if it will work. He looked at her. How long have you been watching it, he said. Since the first servant fell sick in the corridor, she said. The night you were still away. He held her gaze for a long moment. He looked at her the way he looked at things he was revising his understanding of, not changing direction, just finding more of what was already there, more rooms in something he thought he already knew the shape of. More of her than he had already found, which was already more than he had expected to find anywhere. He said nothing more. He walked away and she watched him go and shifted the pile of cloth against her body and went back to work and told herself the way he had just looked at her was not something she needed to carry around for the rest of the day. She carried it around for the rest of the day. By evening the servant was better. Not fully, not in one day, the sickness had been in her body too long for one day to undo it, but measurably, visibly, undeniably better in a way that nobody in that room had seen 5 years of the healer's treatment produce. The healer stood at the bedside and looked at his patient and was quiet for a long time. Then he went to find Cora and he told her quietly and without ornamentation that what she had brought him that morning appeared to be working and that he wanted to understand more about it. Cora received this with the equanimity of a woman who had expected it and said she would be happy to explain it further in the morning. Word moved through the pack house the way word always moved through a place where people lived closely together, fast, person to person, through doorways and corridors, reaching everyone before the evening was fully dark. By nightfall everyone knew that the sickest servant in the house was better. By nightfall everyone knew who had found what the healers had been missing for 5 years. Nara was in the kitchen finishing her work when she heard the voices in the corridor change, a different quality to the noise, people stopping to talk rather than passing through, and understood without going out to check that the word had reached this part of the house. She finished her work and said nothing and went to put the plates away. The guard came to find her as she was leaving the kitchen. He told her there was a young man at the gate asking for her by name. He said he had been there for an hour and had not left and did not appear to intend to leave. She went to the gate. Eid was taller than she remembered. The boy's face she had memorized the day the cart took her away had given way to something harder at the edges, the jaw sharpening, the shoulders broadening, the specific way a young man's face changed when it had been carrying something heavy for long enough to leave a mark. He was standing at the gate with his hands at his sides and his face doing everything at once, relief and guilt and the specific expression of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation for a long time and has just realized that no version of it was going to be adequate. He looked at her and opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again and what came out was not an explanation or an apology or an excuse. It was just her name. Just Nara. Said the way he used to say it when he was 12 years old and she was the only person in the world who was entirely on his side regardless of everything. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the gate. They sat in the garden. He told her everything. He told her he didn't know their father was going to sell her until the cart was already gone, that he had come out of the house and the yard was empty and their father was standing in the doorway with his arms folded and a face that said the matter was settled. He told her he had tried to find her. That their father told him she had gone willingly and that he hadn't believed it but he was 12 years old and there was nothing he could do and the not being able to do anything had lived in him like something infected ever since. He told her their parents were outside the gate. That they had come with him. That they wanted to come in. He looked at his hands. I won't ask you to see them, he said. I just needed to find you. I just needed to know you were all right. He looked up at her face. Are you all right? She looked at him. At his face, their mother's face, their father's stubbornness, and something else entirely that belonged only to him and had always belonged only to him. She looked at him and she listened to what he had said and she knew the difference. She had always known the difference between a man performing innocence and a boy who had been carrying guilt for years and had finally found somewhere to put it down. Yes, she said. I am all right. He nodded. He pressed his lips together hard. Our parents stay at the gate, she said. He nodded again. You can stay tonight, she said. He reached out and took her hand, her right one, and held it the way he used to hold it when he was small and she was the only certain thing in his world and the night was too big for him to be in alone. She let him hold it and looked at the garden wall and breathed slowly and let herself have this. Just this. Her brother's hand in hers in the dark of the garden and the knowledge that he had looked for her and had not stopped looking. It was not everything. But it was something real and it was hers and she was going to hold on to it. They were walking back through the pack house when she heard her name through the open door of the council chamber. She stopped. Ed stopped beside her. The council members were visible through the open door, seated around the long table, the head elder at the far end with papers in front of him, his voice carrying clearly into the corridor. He was laying out the ruling they intended to make in the morning. His voice was measured and formal and completely certain of itself. Pack law was clear. An Omega with a physical impairment could not be recognized as the Alpha's chosen. The union would not be sanctioned by the council. She would be required to leave the pack house within 3 days of the formal ruling. She stood in the corridor and listened to every word. Her face did nothing. Her jaw did not shake. Her hands were still at her sides and her breathing was even, and she stood there and took every word the way she had always taken things, straight on, without flinching, because flinching had never once changed the outcome of anything. When the last word had been said, she turned and walked away. Ed walked beside her. They went down the corridor in silence and turned the corner and kept walking, and the council chamber fell away behind them and the pack house was quiet around them and the night was pressing against the windows. Then Ed said quietly, "What are you going to do?" She walked 3 more steps. "I am going to stand in that room tomorrow," she said. "And I am not going to flinch." Ed looked at her face in the dim corridor light. She looked forward at the long corridor ahead of them, at the end of it, at the morning that was coming, at everything that waited on the other side of it. She was ready. Chapter 9. She woke before dawn. The pack house was still and dark around her and she lay on her mat for a moment looking at the ceiling and listening to the quiet and letting the morning arrive at its own pace. Then she got up and dressed carefully and reached for her sleeve out of habit and pulled it down over her left wrist and stopped. She looked at it. The sleeve. The first thing she did every morning. 5 years of this being the first thing, covering, tucking, making sure nothing showed that might give someone a reason to look at her the way her father had looked at her the morning after the wolf came through the wall. She stood in the quiet of her room in the dark before dawn and looked at her sleeve and breathed once slowly. Then she pulled it back. All the way back. Past the wrist. Past where the arm ended. She looked at what was there in the thin early light coming through her window, the arm exactly as it was, exactly as it had been for 5 years. Exactly as it was going to be for the rest of her life. She looked at it without self-pity and without grief and without the apology she had been carrying for it since she was 17 years old. She rolled the sleeve to her elbow. She went to the door. The council chamber was already lit when she arrived at the corridor outside it. She could hear voices through the door, the measured formal voices of men who had decided something and were preparing to say it officially. She stood in the corridor with Cora beside her and Ed behind her and looked at the door and breathed. Cora put her hand briefly on Nara's left arm, the uncovered one, and squeezed once and released it and said nothing. Nara opened the door and walked in. Cress was already there. He was seated at the head of the table with both hands flat on the surface in front of him and his dark eyes moving across the room with the absolute authority of a man in his own house who had made a decision and was waiting for everyone else to arrive at the same place. The council elders were in their chairs. The head elder had papers in front of him. Everyone looked up when the door opened. Nara walked to the center of the room and stopped and stood there. The room went quiet in the specific way rooms went quiet when something entered them that changed the quality of the air. She stood in the center of it with her left arm uncovered at her side, everything the wolf had taken from her visible to every person at that table, and she looked at the council and she did not flinch. Ed stood at the back of the room. Cora moved to a chair at the side and sat down. Cress looked at Nara from the head of the table and did not look away. The head elder cleared his throat and began to speak. He said pack law was clear and had always been clear and that the council had a responsibility to uphold it regardless of personal circumstance or individual feeling. He said it with the measured authority of a man who believed what he was saying and had believed it for a long time. Nara let him finish. Then she spoke. She did not prepare. She did not perform. She simply said what was true in the order it needed to be said, and she said it clearly and without apology and without asking for anything she was not going to name directly. She told them about the night the wolf came through the wall. Not for sympathy, she said that plainly at the beginning, that she was not standing in this room asking for their sympathy. She told them because it was the beginning of everything that followed, and they needed to know the beginning to understand what they were actually ruling on today. She told them what her father said the morning after. She said the word worthless without flinching because she had been flinching from it for 5 years and she was done. She told them what her father did 3 weeks later and what it cost her and what it did not cost him at all. She told them about Tam in the forest, that she did not know who he was, that she would have helped him regardless of who he was, that this was not a virtue she was claiming credit for but simply a fact about who she was that the council should understand before they made their ruling. She told them what she found growing along the south wall of this pack house that the pack healers had been walking past for 5 years. She said it without pride and without diminishment. She said it as a fact, the way she said all of it, because the facts were what they were and she was done dressing them up or down for anyone's comfort. Then she stopped and looked at the council, at every face around the table, one at a time, moving slowly from one end to the other, and she said, "I am asking you to look at me and tell me honestly that what I am is less. Look at this arm and say the word worthless to my face and mean it the way my father meant it. Say it." The room was completely silent. Nobody spoke. Nobody reached for the word. Into that silence Cora stood up. She rose from her chair at the side of the room slowly and with the complete certainty of a woman who had been waiting for this moment for longer than she had told anyone and had known it was coming since the day Nara walked into the market square and stood over her body and took a stone to the face without moving. The room looked at her. She named herself the last living keeper of the old blessing rituals. The practitioner of a tradition the council had outlawed 30 years ago and had never quite managed to extinguish because the old things did not extinguish easily when they were true. She said her name and her title and she held the room with the authority of someone who was not asking for it and did not need it confirmed. Then she invoked the old law. She stated it in full, her voice clear and unhurried, each word placed with the precision of someone who had been holding them ready for a long time. That what the goddess had joined through genuine bond and true witness no council of men had the authority to put asunder. That she had been witness to what had grown between Nara and Alpha Crest from the first day it began to grow. That she was invoking her right as keeper to name it and to protect it under the law that was older than this council and older than the pack law they had cited this morning and older than every man sitting at this table. The head elder opened his mouth. Cora looked at him with those sharp eyes that had seen everything and forgotten nothing and said, "You may challenge the law. You may not challenge the goddess." The room went completely silent. The head elder looked at his papers. He looked at the room. He looked at Cress at the head of the table. Cress was looking at Nara and had not looked away from her since she walked through the door, at her face, at her uncovered arm, at the chin that had not dropped once since she entered this room. The head elder looked at Cora standing at the side of the room with the absolute certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything right on her side. He set his papers down. He said the council needed to deliberate. Cress said they could deliberate now. The head elder looked at him. Cress held his gaze without blinking and without moving and with the specific quality of patience that was not patient at all but had decided to present itself that way. The deliberation took 4 minutes. They did not leave the room. The head elder stood. He read the ruling in the measured formal voice he used for all official proceedings and he did not editorialize and he did not add anything that was not required. The pack law stood as written, it would always stand as written. But the old law, properly invoked by a recognized keeper in good standing, superseded council sanction in matters of genuine bond between two willing parties. The union between Alpha Cress and Nara was recognized under the old law. The pack law objection was formally noted and formally overruled. He sat down. The room was quiet. Then one of the younger council members, a man with a serious face who had said nothing throughout the entire proceeding, stood and looked at Nara and inclined his head. A single deliberate nod. Then he sat back down. The head elder looked at Nara for a long moment across the table. Then he inclined his own head. Just once. Just slightly. But he meant it. Cress crossed the room to her. He walked from the head of the table to where she was standing in the center of the room and stopped in front of her and looked at her face, at her uncovered arm, at her chin still level, at everything she had walked into this room carrying and had not put down once since she arrived. He reached out and took her left arm in both his hands. He looked at it. He looked at it the way he had wanted to look at it since the day in the garden when her sleeve pulled back for 1 second and he had set something in front of her without commenting and they had both kept working and said nothing. He looked at it fully and completely and without flinching and without the careful performance of not noticing, just looking, just seeing, just acknowledging it as part of her the way every other part of her was part of her. Then he looked at her face. "You have been carrying this alone for too long," he said quietly. Her jaw worked once. She breathed through her nose slowly and held herself together with everything she had left and looked at him and said nothing because there were no words for this that were adequate and she was done using inadequate words. He stepped closer and put his arms around her and she pressed her face against his chest and closed her eyes. She let him hold her. For the first time in 5 years she did not hold herself upright alone. She let someone else take some of the weight and she stood there in the council room with her face against his chest and her one arm against his back and she breathed and let it be exactly what it was. Isolde was at the back of the room. She had been there since Nara walked in. She had watched all of it, the arm, the speech, Cora rising, the ruling, Cress crossing the room. She watched him hold Nara now with the face of a woman watching the end of something she had been holding onto for so long that letting go of it was going to leave marks. She turned and walked out of the room quietly. Nobody stopped her. Nobody followed her. But the audience saw her face in that last moment, not the warm composed surface she had been wearing since the day she arrived, not the calculating certainty of a woman managing a situation. Just her face. Just a woman who had loved someone for a long time and had handled the losing of him badly and was now walking away from it with what dignity she had left. She was not a villain. She had never been only a villain. She was a woman who loved someone and lost. That was all. That was enough. Ede was in the corridor when they came out. He had been standing there since the door closed behind Nara and he had not moved and his face had been doing everything for the entire duration of whatever was happening on the other side of that door. When Nara came through he crossed to her and put both arms around her and held on and she let him and held him back with her one arm and pressed her face briefly into his shoulder and breathed. At the far end of the corridor her parents were standing. Her mother's hands were folded in front of her. Her father's head was bowed, not in the natural way of a man who was simply standing, but in the specific way of a man who knew he was being looked at from a distance and had decided that looking at the floor was easier than looking at what he had done. Nara looked at them. She looked at her father's bowed head and thought about the coins he had picked up from the dirt with both hands and the satisfaction on his face as he walked away and the way he had turned the corner without looking back. She looked at her mother's hands folded in front of her and thought about every moment her mother had chosen the wall over her daughter's face. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she turned back to Ede and said his name and he looked at her face and understood and nodded and stayed beside her. They walked back toward the pack house together and the corridor behind them grew quiet and her parents remained where they were and nobody went back for them. Tam was in the garden. He was sitting at the base of the large tree with his knees pulled up and his serious dark eyes fixed on the garden gate with the focused patience of a child who had decided to wait and was not going to be moved from that decision by anything the morning had to offer. When Nara came through the gate he was on his feet and across the garden before she had fully closed it behind her and he walked directly into her and wrapped both arms around her waist and held on with everything he had. She put her one arm around him and held him back and pressed her face into the top of his hair and breathed in slowly. Cress came through the gate behind her. Tam looked up at him over Nara's arm with those dark serious eyes, Cress's jaw and a child's face, his mother's eyes, the specific watchful quality of a boy who had grown up around loss and had learned to recognize its opposite when it finally arrived. He looked at Cress for a moment. Then he reached out with one hand and grabbed Cress's sleeve and pulled both of them toward him at the same time and held on to both of them and put his face down between them and said nothing. The three of them stood in the garden in the morning light and said nothing and held on. Eid stood at the garden gate with his hands in his pockets and his eyes wet and his mouth pressed together and said nothing either because there was nothing to say that the garden wasn't already saying better. Later the garden was quiet. Cress had gone back inside. Eid had gone to find food because he was 18 and had been standing in corridors for hours and needed food. Tam had fallen asleep against the base of the tree with his head on Nara's leg, his serious face completely slack in sleep, his small hand still loosely holding the hem of her dress. Nara sat with her back against the bark and looked at her left arm resting in her lap, uncovered, exactly as it was going to be from now on. She thought about the night the wolf came through the wall. She thought about Eid's face when she turned around and he was unharmed. She thought about her father's voice the next morning saying the word that had lived in her chest for 5 years. She thought about the cart and the road and the forest and the pup in the roots of the tree and the torchlight coming through the trees and Cress's face in the dark above her. She thought about Cora's hands holding both of hers equally in the dark of her room. She thought about Cress holding her arm this morning with his full attention and without flinching. She put her hand in her pocket and found the stone. Tam's stone. Small and smooth and pale, carried with her every day since he pressed it into her palm in this garden on the day she had been deciding whether to leave. She took it out and looked at it in the morning light. She closed her fingers around it and looked up at the sky above the garden walls, the sky open and gray and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened in this house and this garden and this pack and going on anyway the way the sky always went on, and she breathed out. Slowly. Completely. Everything she had been carrying released with it, not because it hadn't happened, not because the years hadn't cost her what they cost her, but because she was still here. She had made it through every single thing the world had thrown at her and she was sitting in this garden in the morning light with a stone in her hand and a boy asleep on her leg and a brother who had come back and an old woman who had stood up in a room full of powerful men and spoken her name like it meant something and a man who had looked at her arm this morning like it was simply part of her. She was still here. She opened her hand and looked at the stone lying in her palm, small and smooth and pale and entirely unremarkable except that it had been given to her by a child who had decided she was worth giving things to before anyone else in this house had decided anything about her at all. She closed her fingers around it again. She smiled. A real one. Quiet and entirely hers and not performing anything for anyone. Just her face doing something it had not done without effort in a very long time. Tam shifted against her leg in his sleep and made a small sound and was still again. She looked down at him. At his serious sleeping face. At the small hand still loosely holding the hem of her dress like even in sleep he was making sure she wasn't going anywhere. She was not going anywhere. She leaned her head back against the bark of the tree and closed her eyes and let the morning sit around her and said nothing and needed nothing and for the first time in 5 years felt the specific quiet of a woman who had finally, after everything, arrived somewhere she was allowed to stay. She came into this pack with nothing. One arm. No family that wanted her. No rank. No protection. Nothing. She left nothing behind her except the version of herself that believed her father when he said the word worthless. That version is gone. And she is still here. Romance World Stories. If this story lived in your chest, leave a comment below. Tell us the moment that broke you. Tell us which scene you are still thinking about. Subscribe. Share it with someone who needs a story like this. And come find us on Patreon, because what happened next between Nara and Cress, every detail of it, raw and unfiltered, is waiting for you there. We will see you in the next one.